All right. So hi everyone again. My name is Nikki and I am an outreach technician at the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. We at the Trust are just so happy to host, as I said, a webinar today near the end of our webinar season. And we would like to start off with the land acknowledgement. We always ask that you stay mindful during our land acknowledgements. It's really important to listen to the words and listen to what they mean. And sorry, I'm trying to get rid of that, but we'll see. There we go. So we would like to start off by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We would also like to acknowledge the land we are on is at the meeting place of the two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest Indigenous community. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step to reconciliation is acknowledging the existence of Indigenous people. A shared understanding of how our collective past brought us to where we are today will help us walk together into a better future. We give deep gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of these lands who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor this land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. So for those that don't know, the Oak Ridges Moraine stretches about 160 kilometers long. It is a geological feature created 13,000 years ago and very unique to Canada, Southern Ontario. It's home to hundreds of rare and at-risk species, which is why it's so important to us, and it's a source of drinking water for over 250,000 people. As I said, it stretches over about 160 kilometers. It is narrow, but very long. We have neighbors of the Moraine all the way to Northumberland and Caledon. A little bit more about the Moraine. We have lots of water features. 90% of the Moraine is in private ownership, which is sort of where we come in. And as I said, 5% of the Moraine is wetlands, which is really important habitat, as well as kettle lakes and bogs and fens. So in terms of what we do, we protect land forever. So we secure land through a bunch of different ways. And the whole point is that it will never be developed on, and we will improve it, hopefully, to be more ecologically sound. So far, we have 60 properties, so that's 4,400 acres across the Moraine. It's really exciting, and we are working to make that number even bigger. Again, this is a map of the Moraine, but this time it shows us approximately where our properties are. You can see they stretch along the entire Moraine, and some of them are even outside the Moraine. So we don't have too many boundaries to work with, and although these aren't completely accurate dots, they do give you a good idea. One of the ways that we protect land is through the Ecological Gifts Program. This is a really fantastic program that federally protects the land. It allows landowners to leave a legacy for future generations, considering it will be protected forever. It gives significant tax benefits for the landowners and contributes to biodiversity, which is something that is extremely needed in Southern Ontario. Lastly, we also do outreach and education programs. You should all be somewhat familiar with this, since this webinar is a good example of it. We have a bunch of fantastic sponsors for all of our upcoming programs, which allow us to do them for free. So we do webinars, we do walks, and we do competitions as well. Some of our upcoming webinars have to do with dragonflies, fungi, and mammals. We have, again, fantastic upcoming speakers. And as the weather gets warmer, we're also going to be doing bio blitzes, some really fun competitions that anyone can sort of virtually participate in and get outside in their own backyards. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Chris.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Nikki. There we go. So let's share.
Oh, sorry, Chris. I should also mention that if you do have questions during the presentation, Because there are a lot of us, it would be really helpful to put them in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat. It's a lot easier to keep track of the questions there. If you do put them in the chat, they might get lost, and we'll be doing questions or answering questions at the end, but feel free to put them in as Chris does his presentation. All right, Chris, your turn.
Awesome, thanks, Nikki. Okay, everyone, so yeah, thanks for tuning in. Quite excited for this. It'll be great to talk about Ontario's bats again, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. So yeah, today we're going to be going over kind of a, you know, when you do presentations for a large group of people, probably coming from quite a diverse background of knowledge, you know, it's always a little bit of a challenge to be too specific or too general. So I'm going to try to go over some basics about bats in general, then talk about the species, of course, we're lucky to have in Ontario, and then talk about some of the conservation concerns facing them, and also some tips on what the general public you know, can do to help protect bats and make more bat-friendly habitat. So that's kind of the general outline of what we're going to be doing today. So without further ado, let me quickly just introduce myself. Only 2 slides about me, don't worry. Let's see if my computer's going to come up right. There we go. So currently, my name is Chris Ketola, and I am the head field research coordinator for a Peruvian NGO. So not a little farther south than Canada normally. So the NGO I work for is named Fauna Forever. And yeah, I oversee our research camp activities in Peru, and then I also directly coordinate our bird, bat, and herpetofauna research. So that's reptiles and amphibians. And you see in this photo, I'm banding a beautiful black-fronted black-fronted nunbird in that photo. But I do have, as I mentioned, a pretty significant amount of experience with bats, obviously in Peru, but also in Ontario. You can see a couple of photos there. I've done, prior to my time in Peru, and I've been in Peru working for about 2 years, but prior to Peru, I was pretty heavily involved in outreach programs involving bats in Ontario, and also bat surveys. And I have very fond memories of bioblitzes. So I'm kind of envious of everyone who's going to get to do some bioblitzes in Ontario this summer in whatever form they take. And obviously, I have a pretty you know, a pretty significant amount of experience doing bat research in Peru. I've sort of helped to spearhead the development of our current bat research program in the Amazonian lowlands in Peru. So that's a little bit about my background, but again, it's not really what we're here for. Although if anybody has any questions about the work I'm doing down there or the work we do, happy to answer. But enough about me. Let's move on to what we're really here for, which is bats in general and across Ontario. So for starters, I always like to kind of just give a bit of an overview about bats overall. So I mean, first thing is obviously they're mammals. They're in their own order, Chiroptera. There's about 18 families of bats across the world. So only one order. They're all in the same order, but about 18, 19, depends on which authority you go by. But we'll go with 18 families. And over 1,400 species in the world. And again, that number changes all the time. And when I was young, there was a lot less bats classified than there are today. And I would expect that number to continue rising. There's probably at least another 200 species of bats in the world that have yet to be described. They may not have never been seen before, but they may not have been properly described. You know, places like Africa and Papua New Guinea in particular are treasure troves of species that are actually waiting to be described. And even in the country I work in Peru, there was 6 species described within the last 2 years. So there's constantly new species of bats being discovered, which is really exciting. And as you can see with the distribution, pretty much everywhere in the world. Antarctica doesn't have any bats. Don't think that's really surprising. But in the Arctic, so above the tree line, you really don't get bats, but you do get bats right up to the northern part of the tree line. So they have a really large distribution, including islands across the world. So very widespread. You'll see in Canada, there is 20 species technically have been recorded within our country. There's probably 18 are more commonly found in the country, but yeah, 20 technically. And in Ontario, 8 species are sort of commonly recorded in the province of Ontario. So that gives you a bit of a baseline. And just to give you a bit of an idea of like how many species of bats there are, the only order of mammal that has more species are rodents. So you can see bats are very speciose. There's an incredible amount of species worldwide, very successful order. But as we'll see, they're quite specialized into each species in their life history traits, which we'll get into next. So now that we have a bit of an idea of sort of, you know, how many there are and, you know, kind of what do we call them scientifically, the next thing I like to go over really quickly is just some basic facts about bats. And I'm sure a lot of you watching already know this, but there might be some people who maybe don't have all these questions answered. So I just like to go over it quickly. So, I mean, the first thing about bats, of course, is they fly. And as I'm sure most of you know, they are the only mammals that can truly fly. A lot of people, especially, you know, children, they're still learning. They hear the term flying squirrel and, you know, it's a mammal that flies, but no, it doesn't. It glides, right? I mean, bats are the only mammals truly capable of flight. And they're one of only 4 groups of animals in the world, in the history of our, you know, our planet, that have ever achieved flight. I mean, obviously insects, pterosaurs, which were, you know, kind of flying dinosaurs. It's not quite that simple, but we'll just go with that. Obviously birds and bats, and that's it. It's only 4 groups of animals that ever achieved true powered flight in the history of our planet, and that makes them pretty remarkable when you really think about it. So that's one really cool thing about bats. The next thing, which is interesting and often a myth, is that bats are blind, or that they have really terrible eyesight. And you know, that's really not true. There are no bats on Earth that are blind. Every single species can see. Some of them see extremely well, and some of them don't see that well. But even the ones that see poorly still see on par with a mouse, for example. So to think that they are completely blind is absolutely a myth. I think a lot of people think that because their eyes are small in some cases. And another reason that a lot of people think that is because a lot of people are aware that bats use echolocation. Excuse me. So when it comes to echolocation, I'm just going to show you this kind of looping example of a bat sonogram. This is actually a species of bat from over here in England. I'm currently in England at the moment. This is a bat I recorded actually in the fall over here. This is a common pipistrelle bat. So what those little lines you'll see there are actually pulses of sound that this bat is using as it's flying around looking for insects. So while it's not true that bats are blind, it is true that most bats use echolocation. Now, there are some bats that don't use echolocation, which I'll get to in a minute, but the majority of bats in the world do use echolocation, including certainly all of the bats that we have in Ontario. So now, you know, I guess one of the questions people often have is, if bats can see, then why do they need echolocation? And that's a complicated subject, but I'm going to give you one quick answer that might give you an idea of how it works. Think of another big group of animal, you know, another type of animal that flies around at night that we all kind of know of, and probably a lot of people like, and those are owls, right? So owls have very, 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 very big eyes, okay? An owl's eye is almost the size of its brain, and that gives it incredible vision at night, the best vision at night of any group of animals. Now imagine putting that eye into a bat. Many of the bats in Ontario weigh about 6 grams. In other words, the eye would weigh more than the body. It just wouldn't work. You couldn't fly around and live on catching insects reliably in a place like Ontario and in most of the world if your eyes were as big as an owl. It just doesn't quite work. There are some birds in the world that are able to get away with it, but their life history is very different. The way they survive, their activity, their size, very, very different. So bats needed a strategy to allow them to catch small insects in the air without having massive eyes. And that's where echolocation comes in. And it's believed the earliest bats were consuming insects, aerial insects, and that's where the evolution of having echolocation came from. There's still a lot of debate about the evolution of bats in general, but most of the evidence suggests that bats have evolved from ancestors that were insectivores, and therefore having this echolocation system is extremely useful. So kind of a long-winded answer, but it gives you a bit of an explanation about why bats are not blind, but also why they have echolocation, why they use it. Now, moving on to keeping with the echolocation, they don't only use it for hunting and finding food. They also use it for basic navigation, but they also use it to find things in their environment, such as water. And actually, if we go back really quickly to this, I won't play it that long because you've seen it enough, but really quickly watch this video. You'll see a tiny little blip near the bottom right there. And it might loop again. This little tiny blip near the bottom. All the calls are pretty consistent, and then suddenly there's this little blip at the bottom. So with that little blip at the bottom, there it went again. What that is actually a social call. So when bats are echolocating, they're not only looking for food, they're also navigating their environment, looking for places to roost. But in many cases, they're actually speaking to each other as well in a range of sound that the human ear cannot actually pick up. Okay, so it's ultrasonic. For most bats echolocating, they're at 20 kilohertz or more, which is about 3 to 4 kilohertz above the highest frequency the average human can hear. So yeah, that gives you a little bit of an insight. Echolocation is a really complicated subject, an amazing subject we could go on about more about. We'll keep moving. And one of the other things that a lot of people associate with bats is being upside down. And it's one of those interesting things that people are like, why? Like, that's just weird, you know? Why are they upside down? Well, I mean, there are some bats that don't hang upside down. There's some that actually prefer to roost more horizontally. But it is true, the vast majority of bats do hang upside down when they're resting, when they're sleeping, when they're eating, even when they're giving birth to the young. And again, there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I'll pick out two really, really important ones. The first one is that it saves energy, because when you're hanging and you drop, you can just take off. You're at full speed almost right away. Gravity's helping you, right? If you live on the ground, you have to fight to get off the ground. And birds, for example, who do take off from the ground, burn off an incredible amount of energy when they're jumping in the air to take off, okay? Some birds have to run on the ground to build up speed, whereas bats are just, no problem. I just drop myself and I'm good to go. So that's, when you think about it, that's pretty obvious. And the other thing is that it really allows bats to utilize habitats and niches within habitats that other animals can't utilize. I mean, think about it. Squirrels, okay, as an example, they're in trees all the time, right? But if you put a squirrel in a cave, it can't really hang upside down from a relatively smooth cave ceiling. Meanwhile, bats just fill some of these caves, and even inside tiny little tree holes, they're able to squeeze in there and then quickly get back out. By hanging, it gives them the ability to save energy, and it also allows them to utilize relatively unoccupied spaces within their habitat. So those are just a couple of the reasons why bats have evolved and continue to utilize areas upside down, hang upside down a lot. And these bats here, these are actually Mexican free-tailed bats, definitely not a species in Ontario. But if any of you have ever heard of Bracken Cave, or maybe you've been down to San Antonio in Texas and you've seen literally millions of bats emerging from caves or bridges, it's this species, Mexican free-tailed bats. And once again, they utilize these caves because they're upside down. Another advantage, actually, too, is that if you have 1 million bats in a cave and they're eating insects and they're, well, to be blunt, pooping all the time, I mean, I can tell you the bottom of the cave is pretty nasty. So if you're hanging above it, it's a lot better than being down there in it. So, you know, that's another obvious reason. So we can think of more reasons, but we'll keep going. And then when it comes to what bats eat, so I, start off with insects, because I said, bats have evolved from insectivorous species, and basically in the northern temperate zone of the entire world, so not just North America, but Europe and Asia as well, all the bats there eat insects. That's it, okay? But as we go into the southern part of temperate regions and the semi-tropical and tropical regions, you find an incredible diversity of feeding habits for bats. So obviously fruit is probably the second most commonly consumed type of food for different species of bats, but it gets more and more specialized. Nectar, and these are incredible bats. Most of these other groups I work with on a very regular basis in Peru. Nectar, fish, yes, there are species that purely specialize in fish. Small mammals, I'm going to show you an example of that species in a minute. Frogs, again, there's a species that's found from the southern United States all the way down into the Amazon, which I've been lucky enough to catch many times, that literally specializes in picking small tree frogs off of branches and leaves in rainforest environments. Amazing. Yeah, scorpions, there's a species of bat that specializes in catching scorpions in the northeastern part of Africa and the western Middle Eastern regions. And blood, yes, there are bats that are truly vampire bats, 3 species in fact, that are found in Central and South America, and they consume 100% liquid blood and nothing else. So pretty diverse array of potential food sources. The one thing about it is that most bat species are not generalists, though. There are a few that could be considered that, but the majority of bat species specialize in one pretty specific group of food. So for example, if you took a bat in Ontario and you tried to give it fruit, it just can't eat it. It doesn't even recognize it as food. If it doesn't have insects, it just will die. That's it. It will starve. It has to have insects. And that's pretty consistent. Again, there are exceptions, but most bats are pretty specialized to feeding on one specific group of food. And in some cases, very specifically a species or a type of fruit, for example. And to give you an idea of how unique some of these bats can be, I guess I'm going to show off a little bit about some of the bats I've caught in Peru. This is the second largest bat in all of the Americas, the woolly false vampire bat. And you can see it's pretty big. It's a little bigger than what we have in Ontario. Yeah, it's a carnivore. It eats small mammals and small birds as well. Actually, I forgot to put small birds in there. My bad. I should have put that. But small mammals and small birds. And you can see how big the teeth are in the one photo. And yeah, let's just say it's using its teeth purely to capture and consume its prey. I won't go into any more graphic details than that. Now, in terms of the reproductive strategies of bats, some basics, just overview. So most bats in the temperate zone, and especially the northern temperate zone, have one birthing event per year. In the tropics, some species will breed twice per year. That really depends on where you're on the tropics, what species, and even the season. A really dry, rainy season, they'll often have one. If it's a wet, rainy season, they might have two. It's variable. And then most species produce one pup. That's what a baby bat is called, per birthing event. But as you're going to see in the presentation later, there are always exceptions to this rule. And we actually have quite a few species in Ontario who will have twins or even more pups in a single litter. But it is very important to focus on one birthing event per summer in the temperate zone. And what that means is that a bat in Ontario will only give birth once. If it has twins, great. If it has a single pup, but it's only once. It can't get pregnant again in May and then give birth in August. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, the bats that we have in Ontario and most bats in the temperate zone across the world, the females get pregnant in the end of the summer and anywhere from beginning of, say, end of August until November, December. It really depends where we're talking in the world. So I won't give you a definite date, but end of summer, early winter, in that range is when they get pregnant. But of course, they don't give birth until next spring. The sperm is actually stored by the female, and she doesn't implant the egg with that sperm until the next spring. And that's meant to coincide with the onset of spring and summer and insects. So the baby can be born, grow, learn, and be ready by the end of the summer. And you can see when you understand that, there's simply no way they could have another birthing event squeezed into a limited window in the northern part of the temperate zone. So it's really important when you understand sort of that bats have a low reproductive rate, and they have a relatively long lifespan as well. Bats can live I'd say the average maximum lifespan is about 10 to 15 years, but there are records of bats living 20, 30, and even into their 40s, okay? So bats live a long time. They're not like mice and rats and many rodents who have a very fast reproductive cycle, lots of babies, and lots of death. I'm going to be completely honest, that's kind of rodents, and shrews. It's just a fast turnover. Bats aren't really like that. And this will give you a bit of an idea of why some bats have a lot of trouble recovering when their population crashes, which is unfortunately something we will be talking about a little bit later on. And to give you an idea of what it's like for a bat with a baby, I mean, this is, again, a bat down in Peru. This is a fruit bat that we caught in our net during our research. And you can see the baby's actually right there under the wing nursing. So for bats, the bats in Ontario basically leave their babies roosting while they feed, and they only carry them when they have to move the baby. But for many species, especially fruit bats, they'll actually carry the baby with them as they're actively feeding. But either way, baby bats are very big when they're born. They are normally 20 to 40% of the size of the mother when they're born. So you can do the math on what that would be like for a human, and it's a pretty frightening thought, really. I already have incredible respect for women having human babies as it is, and wow, I can't imagine what that would be like having a baby that is 40% of your body weight. So yeah, female bats are superheroes. All females are superheroes, and female bats especially are superheroes. And quickly, not to talk too much about tropical bats anymore, but some people wonder, maybe you've been to Australia, Africa, in a non-COVID year, you've gotten a chance to travel. And yeah, I mean, bats come in a variety of sizes. I mean, this is arguably the biggest species of bat in the world, Tropus vampirus. And this is a bat that has a wingspan about 5 feet. I mean, it's a very, very large bat, but it eats only fruit, this species. And flying foxes in general eat only fruit. And in fact, these large, big bats that are often referred to as flying foxes are only found in the old world tropics. So we're talking Africa, Asia, Australia. You don't have any of them in the Americas. North, Central, South, they are not found there. And Eurasia, they're not found there, okay? In the old days, we would call them the megabats or Megachiroptera. It's become a little more complicated recently, thanks to DNA and different research. We've learned that some of the small bats are actually related to the big bats. But in a very general sense, flying foxes, the really big bats, are found, again, Africa, Asia, Australia, definitely not in Canada. And of course, some bats can be very small as well. This is the smallest species of bat in the world. It's also called the bumblebee bat. Some of you may have heard of it. And yeah, you can see that's an adult in someone's hand, and it is, its body is actually, looks a little smaller than the size of that person's thumb. So they come in a pretty significant range of sizes and shapes. And even some are very colorful, which actually in Ontario, we have a few, and you'll see that soon. So that is a bit of an introduction to bats in general. And then the final thing I like to talk about is there's a lot of myths and sort of beliefs out there about bats that are not really true. And some of them can be very harmful to the reputation of bats. So the first one is, that most bats have rabies, or that a lot of them, or that, when you see a bat, oh, it could be rabbit. I mean, I think more and more people realize this isn't true, but there are still people out there who believe this to be true. And, the reality is it's about 1% or less of bats would have rabies. And because bats have a much higher population than, say, a fox or a raccoon or a skunk, the percentage of population of raccoons, foxes, and skunks that have rabies is actually higher. That doesn't mean there's more raccoons, skunks, and foxes that have rabies. I'm not saying that. But because bats have generally much bigger quantities of individual animals, the percentage is actually very, very, very low, okay? But again, as I said, it's extremely important. That doesn't mean you should see a bat and just go pick it up and cuddle it. And if you sit on the ground, whether it's acting normal or funny, it doesn't matter. Do not pick it up with your bare hands ever, any wild animal. One thing about bats is that because they're so small, sometimes when they bite you, especially in Ontario at least, they're small, you sometimes won't feel it at all. And you'll look at it and be like, oh, little pinch. Oh, there's no blood, I'm fine. But again, in the very unlikely scenario that bat has rabies, it doesn't have to draw blood for you to possibly get it. So you should never, ever, ever, ever touch them with bare hands. And if you do feel that you came into contact potentially getting bitten by one, you should always try, make sure you go to a doctor or a hospital and get your vaccination, your shots for rabies. It is very rare, but we're certainly not encouraging anyone to say, it's fine, just touch them. That's not the case. Anyone who works with bats has a rabies vaccination. And yeah, we always want to be careful about that. So the other myth that often I've heard from people is that bat feces, their guano, their poop, is toxic and can kill you if you're near it. So again, the reality is that bat feces themselves, when they're fresh, are not toxic in most parts of the world. There are a few areas where, some of the tropical regions where there might be some potential localized diseases that can occur. Obviously, COVID is a whole other subject. I'm not going to jump into that in the moment, although I'm happy to talk about it later if you want. But I'm focusing on Ontario here, and basically, a bat's droppings is not toxic, okay? However, histoplasma, again, can grow on these feces, and this is a fungus which can be very damaging to the lungs of people, okay? But the key to point out about this is that it's not just bats. It can happen on birds, it can happen on other small mammal droppings, okay? And I'm pointing this out because bats are often associated with it as though it's something to do only with bats, because people are scared of them or they don't like them, and they want to look for things to focus on because they're scared of them. And when you understand more about the science, about the reality, you realize bats are basically, in most cases, harmless. They're not out there to hurt us. And there's very little about them that are dangerous to us as long as we use basic common sense. So, I mean, I think those are two really common but also important myths that people have to sort of dispel and get out of their minds. If you have any type of animal droppings in your home or anywhere where it's been not exposed to the sun, essentially, there's a big risk of histoplasma, and you should always wear gloves, wear a mask, ventilated area, be very careful. You shouldn't just go in willy-nilly with shovels and be, scooping up, or brooms, scooping up droppings. It's just not smart. It doesn't matter where it came from. Be careful if you have droppings in your home of any kind or anywhere you're around when you're cleaning up, especially, again, if they haven't been outside exposed to the sun. UV usually kills these things, but in human environments, areas where there's no sun, that can be dangerous for sure. All right, so let's get to the sort of exciting part, and it's always a little difficult, for me to decide: do I introduce the species and then talk about some of the challenges, or do I do it the other way around? Well, I'm going to introduce the species, and then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges facing them. So you'll hear me reference a few times white nose syndrome, or WNS. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard about it. Some of you probably know a lot about it. I will talk about it in a minute, but I thought I would just introduce the species to you first. They're not in any specific order. I suppose you would say the larger and more common species, today at least, are first, and then the smaller and unfortunately endangered species are last. But this isn't based on a scientific taxonomic order. It's just kind of big and common to small and little, just in case you guys are wondering how I've ordered this. So to start off with the big brown bat, which I just love common names, it's big brown bat. Like, let's just call it what it is, Common names are really hilarious for a lot of people who do research with bats and also with snakes and frogs. We often use scientific names because big brown bat, or common names, can just be kind of not that imaginative sometimes, but it's very appropriate, and it does describe this species. They are pretty big and they are brown. This gives you an idea of their range. As you can see, it is a large range. That encompasses basically North America, Central America, and even a small amount in South America. You know, this is a species that is today the most commonly seen bat in most of Ontario. So, you know, if you are go to the cottage or, you know, your backyard or something and you see a bat, it's probably a big brown bat. It doesn't mean it is, but it probably is. They are today the most commonly seen. And then, you know, one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that they do adapt very well to artificial structures, buildings, attics, etc. They're probably, well, they are one of the two most adaptable bats, I would say, in Ontario. And we'll talk about the other one later, but this is definitely one of them. And, you know, one of the things that makes them quite unique as well is that they can hibernate in artificial structures. In other words, your attic. A lot of most of the other species of bats, with rare exceptions, are not hibernating in human structures. Again, I guess you could say an old mine is a human structure. But when I think of a human structure, I think the house or a barn or you know, like a business or something, right? Apartment building, whatever. And most of the bats in Ontario really don't use those for hibernation, but big brown bats will. And that's quite unique to them. And they have not been severely impacted by white nose syndrome. And there's a few theories as to why. But the two theories that are probably most commonly used is that they are willing to be in human areas. And because of that, they spread out in hibernation. Instead of having huge groups, they spread out. And also, they're more tolerant of slightly warmer conditions when they're hibernating, which is actually good because the fungus likes it colder. So there's a couple of reasons why they've probably done a lot better with white nose syndrome than the other species unfortunately have. Again, it's a species that forages almost anywhere. You know, the big exception for them is they're relatively large, so you're not usually going to see them in a dense forest. Bats in general don't like dense forests. There's like a couple exceptions, but you know that generally bats like more open spaces. But these guys are pretty open to different habitats. They're quite adaptable. And then you're going to see this term hawks and gleans. Let me explain that. Hawks means they catch it in the air, okay, like a hawk would, so to speak. Well, I guess maybe more appropriately like a falcon would, but yeah, well, hawking is kind of the term that we use. And gleaning, which you'll see for a couple species, and means that they actually will land on something like a leaf, maybe even the ground, and kind of, or even take it off the water surface. So gleaning is a little different than hawking, okay? So most of the bats we have do hawk, they catch in the air. And yeah, the big brown bat is pretty much accepted that it catches things in the air. And again, it's a bigger bat. It can get up to around 20 grams, which is big for a bat. And yeah, moths and beetles. Beetles are quite common for them. It's a big meal. They've got big teeth. It's nice and crunchy meal for them, so they quite enjoy it. And yeah, normally one pup per summer. That's it for these guys. Moving on to our next species, and one of the more elaborate looking species. I always think the hoary bat, especially this particular photo of it, it looks like some like ancient, like old Victorian dress, like Victorian era dress, you know, with the big hair and the big, I don't know, that's kind of what I imagine. There's such a adorable, cute, pretty, elaborate, whatever term you want to use. They're amazing looking species. Yeah, and you see they have a huge range. So this range is interesting because you'll see in a minute, they're migratory. So some of that southern range is migrants going south, and some of it is resident bats that don't migrate. And there are, for example, quite a few bird species that are like that. You'll have a northern population that migrates, and when they go south, they kind of mix in with the resident population, and then some of them just kind of leave and some stay. So yeah, hoary bats would fall into very similar life history to a lot of birds that migrate, actually. And it is the largest bat in Ontario, around, again, each one's different, but say around 25 grams for them. They're quite large. And then the next two species, including the hoary bat, they roost in foliage. So that's, for a lot of people, maybe a little bit, surprising. I mean, this particular photo is one of the only times you'd be able to see them, because often they're actually mixed in the leaves more and very, very hard to find. So that's quite unique that they roost in foliage. And actually, I'll just focus on that for a sec. As one of the reasons it's believed that both this species and the next one are quite colorful is because if you think about it, that color, if you were in a dark area, would be either unnecessary or it would actually draw attention to you. But when you're out in the leaves, being a solid dark object would actually make you stand out more. Whereas having some color it might seem obvious in the photo, but if you're staring up at the canopy and there's light coming through and there's different colors and there's shadows, you actually will blend in better by not looking like a solid dark object. So that is the reason it's believed that both of these next two species, which really specialize in roosting in foliage, are much more colorful than most of the bats we think of. Again, this is a highly migratory species, and this is a species that migrates, very similar, as I said, to birds. They fly quite high when they migrate. They fly at very high speed. Very interesting bat in terms of life history. There certainly are bats that migrate, but it's not a common thing. Like, there are definitely species all over the world that do it, but it's much less common for bats to migrate than birds because of hibernation, essentially. So when they do it, it's when a species does it, it's actually quite interesting and quite unique. And again, as you can imagine, collisions with wind turbines are a problem. The extent of this is still up for debate for some regions and some organizations, and that's a topic I'm not going to dive deeply into at the moment per se, but it can be an issue. There's no question, and the mortality can be caused because of direct impact, and it can also be caused because of barotrauma, which is, well, I don't want to be too graphic in case anyone doesn't want to hear this at 1 o'clock, but basically the wind pressure can be so extreme for their lungs that it can basically suffocate them in a more violent manner because of the different pressure in their lungs. It can be quite horrible way to go. So wind turbines can be a major problem for migratory birds as well, and certainly bats. And there's still more research to be done all over the world on this subject. It's very complicated, but it is a problem. These guys like to, again, they forage in forest edge and tree rows and water sources. What I would say is, because it's a big bat that flies quite fast and is not as maneuverable, they like to have more open space. So, if you think of a dense forest and then a moderately open forest and then a forest that's near more like a field or something, you're going to find these guys more in the forest near the field because they like the open space more. But, bats don't read their manual, so you can find them a little bit of everywhere. But generally speaking, this is a more open space type of bat. And yeah, this is definitely a hawking species, large moths, large insects. It's a big bat. They like big prey. They'd rather fly around searching for something big and then take their time and eat it than waste the energy eating a whole bunch of tiny little mosquitoes all the time. It's just not what they do. It's also the way their echolocation works. It's a low frequency. They're much better at picking up larger things farther away than tiny things up close. And yeah, these guys normally give birth to twins. And you'll notice that a few of the species that roost in foliage often give birth to twins or more. And there's a lot of theories about that. Whether the mortality rate may be higher, that could be one reason, or it could have to do with the fact that they are migratory, and obviously migration is difficult, and there's generally a higher mortality associated with migration. So it's probably a combination of the two, but if I had to put my money on it, it's probably more related to migration than anything. But that's one of those things that's difficult to prove for sure. It ends up being educated theories rather than absolute proof in many cases. Again, eastern red bat, you can see it's the same genus, so it is related to the hoary bat. And you can also see that its range is not as extensive as the hoary bat, but still quite large. And once again, this is a migratory species. So the northern part is sort of summer breeding, and then the southern part is either resident bats or bats that have come down to migrate. So once again, you see a photo of that one in actual vegetation. Looks like maybe a maple there in the background, I think, I'm not sure. And yeah, once again, this is a species that roosts in foliage. Migratory species, but actually less is known about this species and where it winters than the hoary bat, actually. It's believed that probably the females migrate farther north than the males because of the breeding likely occurs farther south, but even that is still being parsed out, being sort of pieced together. And one of the things is that if there's been a project, for example, with this bat studying the population in Virginia, that may not apply to Ontario and vice versa, because it's a different latitude, it's a different environment. So there's still a lot to learn about many bats, all over the world. And certainly this is one of those species. And again, because it's migratory, it's believed their collisions are a little less common than hoary bats because of the altitude they fly at, but it definitely can still happen. It's still an issue for this species for sure. Again, this species is a little more comfortable in forested environments. They still like openings, but and forest edge and natural clearings, but they really are associated with quality intact forest, even more than the hoary bat. You won't often find them in urban areas, but there's exceptions. I mean, I remember quite well doing just for fun a bat walk on my own one night. You know, what do you do at 10:30 at night in the summer? You walk around a park with a bat detector. I don't know, that's what I do when I was back in Canada. And yeah, I remember getting one and then over my shoulder with the golden arches, because there's a McDonald's over my shoulder. So like, you know, they don't read the manual. Generally, that's where they're found, but of course there's exceptions. So yeah, there's all these strange things occur, but these guys do generally like more intact forest. And again, these guys are a little more generalist. They're willing to take slightly smaller prey often, but they're open to whatever they can kind of catch, medium to large insects. But again, not usually going to focus on really tiny insects. It just isn't really worth their effort. And yeah, these guys actually have the highest reproductive rate in terms of actual births of any bat in Ontario. They give birth to twins almost every time, and they've actually been recorded up to 5 pups, which is very unique. Yeah, now if they have 5 pups, would all 5 survive to adulthood and you know, full size? It's unlikely. In odd cases, at least 1 or 2 of them might die relatively quickly. But yeah, they have quite a high reproductive rate. And once again, it's the same thing I was saying about the hoary bats. The exact reasons are up for debate, but likely has to do with the fact that they're migratory and highly migratory. Moving on to our next bat, silver-haired bat. And now we're getting into bats that are kind of a medium-sized. I guess this is about as close to a medium-sized bat as you can get in Ontario, if you want to use that term. And you see, again, really large range. I mean, it's North America, essentially. And this is a conditionally migrant bat. I mean, this to me, I mean, if anybody knows birds like red-tailed hawks, I mean, because I know I have a lot of experience with raptors. Some of you who know me might know that, but anyways, red-tailed hawks are a good example. You read a book and they're migratory, but if you actually study individuals, you'll find that some of them just kind of stay in an area year-round, and others just go south. And it just depends on the individual. A conditional migrant, sort of. And silver-haired bats are sort of in that vein. I would say the northern population in Canada definitely migrates, but when you get farther south in Canada, like southern Ontario, southwestern Ontario, you'll get some that overwinter for sure. And again, it depends on the season. And with climate change, likely we're going to see more that are overwintering in Canada as well. So silver-haired bat, yeah, again, this is one of these tree. I don't know if I'd use the term specialist, but tree preferential bats. Peeling bark, tree crevices, that's what they like. That's a very important feature for them. They will use artificial, like human structures occasionally, but that's not common. I mean, they like a mature forest with some, you know, woodpecker holes and some peeling bark. Yeah, it's really good for them. Again, conditionally migrant. So yeah, as I explained, you know, southern Ontario southward is where they'll winter, but it's still not even fully known. There's a lot of research to be done, and again, it's likely changing because of climate change as we speak. When they do hibernate, they've been found in, again, tree crevices, wood piles, caves, occasionally buildings. But because they're not heavily associated with caves, and they don't really like buildings much, that's where the trees and wood piles and that kind of thing comes into play. And you can imagine that works a lot better in areas where it doesn't reach -30 in the winter. So if you think, again, not that I'm from Virginia or want to keep referencing it, but I often think of that state as kind of a good example of slightly different than Ontario. And yeah, if you're like North Carolina or Virginia, you can go in a tree and it's like, what is it, -8 sometimes. You might get the odd really cold night, but it's not -20 for 2 weeks on end usually. I'm sure it has happened, but not generally. And for this bat, that being in a tree, a big tree, a crevice, that would be very good for them to hibernate in that. When they are foraging, you know, they're again pretty flexible where they forage. So natural habitats, water sources, urban parks, pretty flexible. They're also species that they don't like to cover as much ground in this given night. They're a little more lazy about how far they go. They're kind of a generalist feeder. They feed on, as you can see, medium to small insects. They like water a lot, so if there's water bodies around and they don't have to go that far, you'll often see them scooching back and forth over a pond for quite a while, just you know, hawking in the air, and as it says, gleaning as well. They will glean occasionally insects like off the surface of the water, and also occasionally they'll glean insects off of leaves as well. So they're quite willing to be flexible about that. And then they often give birth to twins as well. And once again, this is a partially migratory species, so that may be why twins are common for them. Or yeah, moving on to the 4 smallest species, and now unfortunately we're going to get into some species that are in a little more trouble. So little brown bat, big range technically. Again, the population in that range is quite different than it used to be, but it is a big range naturally. So as you can see, this species and all the next 4 species I'll talk about are listed as endangered in Ontario and also on the IUCN. So their population is drastically lower. You know, this was at one time the most common bat in North America. In fact, it was the most common non-human mammal in Eastern North America before white nose syndrome came along. It has devastated their population in most of their range, which I'll show you a map of in a few moments. But prior to that, it was very common. And again, in normal situations, it readily adapts to, you know, buildings. It uses caves, trees. It's very much like the smaller version of a big brown bat. They're not the same genus at all, but it is generally very adaptable. And one thing, you know, you've heard me say little brown bat or little brown Myotis. It's interchangeable, honestly. You can use either term. I've decided to use Myotis for this because if some people read it on a government site or a guide, they might be confused. Whereas, you know, if I say bat, little brown Myotis, it's the same species. Okay, as I said, common names can be confusing. So if you're wondering, well, he said bat, it says Myotis. Yeah, it's just common names. Just go with it. Little brown Myotis, little brown bat, same species. And yeah, these guys hibernate in large groups, in caves in most cases, very large groups. In some cases, historically, you'd be talking between 10 to 20,000 bats in one cave. Very social in the way they hibernate. Forages, again, very, very flexible. In normal times, these would have been the bats. Like, you know, if you're old enough to have been, you know, at a cottage in the 90s or any time before that, and you saw bats, it was a good chance it was these back then. It might have been big brown bats, but it was probably these ones. And if you've noticed, bats used to be common and they're not anymore, that is probably because you had little brown Myotis or little brown bats and you no longer do. They are pretty flexible naturally. And again, these guys, small insects. So you talk about mosquitoes and small moths and small insects. These are what you want. These are the guys that are taking them out of the air. And yeah, 1 pup per year. That is basically the rule with very few exceptions. Moving on to our 6th species, I believe, northern long-eared Myotis, or northern bat or northern Myotis. Again, they're all the same species, but there's a lot of different common names you'll see listed in different areas. Always good if you're not sure to check that scientific name, then you can be sure you have the right one. Again, a large range, especially eastern part of North America. And again, this is endangered sadly as well in our province. Population, again, has declined across areas where white nose syndrome is present. This is a species, again, that prefers trees generally, tree cavities and caves sometimes, but tree cavities, especially in areas where there are no caves, which is, you know, a large part of the province. Many provinces don't have access to good caves. You'll definitely find these using tree cavities and then occasionally peeling bark as well. And buildings, you know, occasionally, but not as kind of in that order, I would say. But again, they vary. It depends on where you are in the province and where you are in their range. These guys hibernate in caves generally. That is, and sometimes you'll find them mixed in with you know, little brown Myotis and other cave hibernating species. And once again, the species prefers more intact forest in general, and you know, near water and even continuous forest. I mean, I can remember doing a bat walk at the Courtright Center. Actually, I mean, you guys probably, a lot of you know that center, and I'll never forget it. It was so cool, and I wish the people behind me had seen it. My God, but sometimes you just can't help it. But I got the bat on the bat detector. I knew the species, and I watched it up ahead, whizzing in between pine trees, about 1.5 feet off the ground, and just like circling the trees. So agile. It was stunning. And these guys have the highest frequency of echolocation of any bat in Ontario. And really quickly, when you have a higher frequency, the sound doesn't travel as far, but it gives you better detail. So that indicates this species likes to forage in cluttered environments like the forest. So this is slightly more adapted to forest environments. You'll still find them out in the open, but they're quite comfortable in more denser, tighter areas. And this is their niche. You know, the little brown Myotis, a little more open spaces, and then when it's a little tight for them, this species can sometimes fill that niche. Again, hawks and gleans as well, small insects, and again, normally one pup per year. And moving on to eastern small-footed Myotis, or eastern Myotis, or small-footed Myotis, again, it's all the same species. It is a pretty small range, you'll notice. It's not the smallest range of a bat in northeastern North America. That would be the Indiana bat that has the smallest range, which, not to confuse you guys, Indiana bat has possibly been detected in Southwest Ontario a couple times, but it's still debatable, so I left it off of this. But yeah, I don't want to confuse everybody, but if you hear of that species, at least I addressed it. But yeah, eastern small-footed Myotis has the second smallest range in the northeast of North America. And yeah, it's again, once again, endangered. And this was already, as you can tell, one of the rarest bats in North America before white nose syndrome existed. And white nose syndrome has had, it's almost hard to understand the impact it's had on their population because they were already so rare to begin with. So it's likely hurt them, but we don't even probably know the percentage of impact because of how hard they were to detect before white nose syndrome. It's believed these guys primarily like rock crevices. They will use tree cavities as well, but a lot of research has shown that they have a high association with like limestone caves, just cliff faces, areas where there's fissures in rocks. Again, they really like to hibernate in caves generally, and again, sometimes with other species, which is very similar to the other Myotis species. They do also prefer intact forest if they can have it, so they'll often say roost near a cliff or a cave, and then forage in areas that are much more protected, much less disturbed in general. But once again, there are exceptions. We actually caught one at a BioBlitz once. That was actually at the Courtright Center, which is nice habitat, but I mean, it is still surrounding it is relatively urban or farmland. So it shows you that if there's nice habitat where they can live, they can be found. Small insects, we don't really know whether this gleans or not. It hawks for sure. It may glean. It isn't enough data to confirm it really. Once again, normally one part per year. And finally, our last species to introduce you to, the tricolored bat. And some of you might have heard of it called the eastern pipistrelle. It used to be called that. Again, complicated. If you have an old mammal book, maybe it might say eastern pipistrelle. It is the same species. So we call it the tricolored today because if you look at, you can't see it in the photo really, but if you actually have it in your hand and you look at the fur, each strand of fur has three different shades of color on it, which is where the term tricolored comes from. But it's not a pipistrelle. Where I am right now in England and Europe, there's lots of pipistrelles, but we don't actually have any true pipistrelles in the Americas at all. That's its range, once again, eastern half of North America down into Mexico. And yeah, it is sadly endangered as well. Once again, the population has declined since white nose syndrome. It's kind of unique in that it actually is believed to often use like naturally occurring clumps of dead leaves, even like an old bird nest or an old squirrel's dray occasionally, but they also are known to use tree cavities and caves. And what this indicates is that there is no definite consensus on what they're using in different parts of their range. And there's definitely further research required to identify more what their preference for roosting is across their entire range. Hibernates in caves is generally accepted where they hibernate. Trees occasionally, especially in the southern part of the range, but for us in Ontario, it's usually going to be caves. Yes, they're really strongly associated with water. So they like forest that's near water. You rarely find them in areas where there's no water. They do really like to forage over the water or near the water at the forest edge when they can. They're hawking small insects, quite an aerial species. And yeah, they actually give birth to twins, which is interesting because they don't really migrate. So why are they giving birth to twins? Is that because they like to roost in foliage? Is that indication of that? You know what? They know, I don't know. And no one knows for sure, other than theories. There's no definite answer as to why that is. So that gives you an idea of the species. And I know, as is common with me, I'm just talk quite a bit, but I think I still have a decent, probably about 10 minutes at least before we'll take questions. So we're going to keep moving on to some of the threats facing the bats in Ontario. And I've been referencing white nose syndrome, and I'm going to just jump off really quickly to talk about that in a little more detail right now. So white nose syndrome, Pseudogymnoascus destructons is the scientific name of the fungus. So it was first detected in New York State in 2006. It was a dark day when we look back on it now. It is believed to be European in origin. It's been found in caves across most of Eurasia. Yeah, so it's almost certainly an invasive species, probably brought here, obviously unintentionally, probably by cavers, hikers, maybe even bat researchers. We don't know. We'll never know. And it's not about blaming people at all anyways. But it is an invasive species, which has had a really bad impact on bats, unfortunately. It's now been detected in 7 Canadian provinces and 36 American states. So very widespread now. This gives you an idea of this is the most current map. As you can tell, it goes to 2018, 2019, because the 2019-2020 season, well, that wasn't able to be done because of COVID, unfortunately. And this year as well, there won't be an update for 2020, 2021 likely as well. So we don't even know. We're kind of in the dark the last couple of years how much more it's spread, unfortunately. Hopefully by next year we'll be able to get a really good update on that. You notice by the color scheme of it, it sort of has a really bad impact, and then it sort of dies out a bit, which is to say a lot of bats are found dead in hibernation when it shows up. And then those areas kind of just disappear of bats, or the death rate drops, and then it kind of spreads out. I would say the spread rate has slowed over the last 4 or 5 years. Whether that is natural, whether that's because people have been more cautious about exploring caves and spreading it, or whether it's both, can't say for sure, but it's good that it's slowing down, but it is still slowly spreading. And I think it's likely at some point it will be found in most states and provinces across North America. You can't really stop it fully, but you can slow it down, hopefully. In terms of how it kills bats, a lot of you may already know this, but it doesn't, there is some debate and there's some question, and it does vary bat to bat. But as a general rule, what it's normally doing is actually causing them to starve to death. For starters, the name comes from what you can see on the front of the bats in these photos, the white ring. That is the fungus growing. And you also look closely, a few of them have it on their ears as well. You'll see some really extreme cases here of the fungus growing in their face and on their ears and on their hands, their wings. And you'll see here, the white spots are on the wings of the bat as well. I'm going to show you this. Now, this is actually taken at a Presqu'île Provincial Park. I was helping with the bat survey. It was about two or 3 years ago now. I can't remember. And you'll see this little brown Myotis. The white marks on the wing are scar tissue. So basically, everywhere where it's white, the wing was almost destroyed by the fungus and has grown back. And the researcher I was working with, the head of the project, who's holding the bat in that video, she said it was one of the worst cases she's ever seen in her life. It was pretty horrific. So the normal way it kills bats is starvation. And what I mean by that is that if you're a bat and it's January and your wing is burning and your face is burning because of a fungus, you wake up. When you wake up and you can't eat because it's January in Ontario, you starve, because a bat being awake for a full day in January can burn off up to or more than 1 month of hibernation. So if you're awake 3 days in January, you're basically dead, because your time limits, your food reserves are just going to run out. And there's quite a few horrible videos and photos I've seen of bats flying over snowy fields in January because they're starving or they're thirsty. And yeah, the mortality rate when it gets into a cave can be over 90%. So it's really bad, to be honest. In terms of what is being done with it, I'll get back to this in a second. I guess what I would say is there's a lot of work being done on it across, but there is no one simple answer to it. And I'll get into maybe some more ideas about what's being done and how people can help in a moment. So we'll sort of touch on that in a second, but there's no simple solution, but there is some hope. I'll finish with that and then come back to it, I promise. In terms of the other threats, which I'm just going to touch on briefly, because a lot of these apply to many animals all over the world, including Ontario. Habitat loss is a massive problem anywhere you go. Obviously that is arguably, we could debate, and it depends on the area and the species, but it's definitely, if it's not the #1 threat, it's probably up there, top 1 or 2 or 3 threats to biodiversity in the entire planet is loss of habitat. And that certainly applies to bats as well. Although the big brown bats do okay with human structures, they still need some insects, they still need some habitat. And as you've seen, many of the species directly rely upon quality habitat to exist. Pesticides and pollution, well, quite simply, if you're talking about bats that only eat insects and we're using heavy pesticides to kill insects, the two don't really work out, do they? So it's kind of obvious that when you put toxins in the environment, it can directly kill their prey and potentially have long-term effects we're not even aware of. Bioaccumulation is not believed to be as big of a problem in bats as it is in, say, birds, which is to say, the toxins building up in the predator, but it's still maybe having unintentional consequences we're not even aware of yet. And just generally speaking, if you're killing the prey of the predator, that's not good for the predator. It's pretty straightforward, I think. Wind turbine collisions, yeah, it's a very complicated subject because, of course, alternative energy is amazing, and it's the future. It's what we need to do to protect the planet. But also, nothing is free, so to speak. Everything has a downside. Nothing's perfect, right? And yeah, the wind turbine collisions for bats and birds is a really complicated subject, and it can lead to problems for populations. So it's just something that needs to be heavily studied, and very careful in the placement and the usage of these wind turbines. That's how I'll leave it for now, without going into a lot of details about it. And yeah, climate change, I mean, listen, that's a threat to every single living thing on this planet. We know that. And in terms of how it affects bats, I'll give you one really good example. So I've told you that the females get fertilized by the males in the fall, and then they save that sperm, and then they fertilize the egg in the spring. Well, that fertilization is stimulated mostly by temperature, somewhat photoperiod, but mostly temperature. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember that where I grew up, east of Toronto, it would be snow in the ground till the end of April. And if you got a day in March where it was 5 degrees, you're like, oh my God, it's so warm, but there's still 2 feet of snow on the ground, right? Well, that's not the case anymore where I grew up, and most of Ontario has changed. So when we have days in March where it's 20 Celsius, which is happening almost every year now, it's great, it's fun, we go outside and there's no snow on the ground, and it's like, yeah. The problem is for bats, that means it's time to breed soon, you know, or it's time to give birth soon. So the females start to be active, they start to inseminate their young, their eggs with the sperm, and once they start developing the embryo, that's it. They can't turn it off. So when we get those weird days in the last 2 weeks of April where it's cold and miserable and there's snow, and we're like, oh, you know, I hate this. It's actually kind of normal, but the problem is the bats have already started their breeding. And this is a problem worldwide. It's not just Ontario. I mean, there's been papers over here in the UK and Europe as well, that these cold springs that have had warm winters can have really big impacts on the reproductive success of bats. And this kind of thing happens with birds as well. So when the timing of the natural climactic rhythm is thrown off, it can have really bad impacts. And, you know, 1 year is an anomaly, but if it happens all the time, you know, that can have big impacts on the population. That's just one way the climate change can directly impact bats. Now, finally wrapping it up with sort of how people can help, and also what's being done. So I'll start off with sort of what's being done at sort of national, sort of governmental, organizational level. I mean, for starters, there's a multinational task force working on white nose syndrome, American, Canadian, an incredible amount of collaboration. The bat community is really tight knit and everybody works together. There's no borders with bats, basically. And yeah, there's amazing people working. The amount of research is just breathtaking. And the fact that there isn't a cure, that there isn't one definite way to fix it, it's not because there hasn't been work. It's because it's just really hard. How do you fix this? How do you cure it? I mean, there's been some research that's shown you can treat the fungus with, like, you know, a medicine and kill the fungus. But if you're holding the bat to do it and you let it go, it's going to starve anyways in the winter. It's just really complicated. If you fumigate the cave, you're going to stress the bats out, and you might kill, you know, beneficial fungus. And plus, how can you stop fungus from spreading? Once it's out in the air, the spores are pretty much everywhere. So it's very, very difficult to just stop white nose syndrome. What I would say is the best hope right now, which I'll lead into a bit, is protecting the species that the individuals we still have, because there's a lot of evidence growing that certain individuals have survived white nose syndrome and they have some form of genetic immunity or resistance to it. And when those can start to breed, the population will very slowly be able to rebound. But of course, for that to work, they need to have habitat. They need to be able to live. We need to protect every single bat today more than ever, because if it's alive today, it's kind of a hero. It's survived white nose syndrome, especially for those species impacted by it. And, you know, white nose syndrome and just interest in general has increased, which has meant that bat research has just skyrocketed. You know, when I was young, there was not much out there, and there's so much more research worldwide on bats today, and it's great. You know, when you start to know more about them, the more it just gets. They're such an exciting group of animals to research and work with. You know, in terms of protection, the 4 species that are considered species at risk in Ontario, you know, they do receive protection under the Ontario Endangered Species Act. So surveys have to determine, you know, presence or absence, and if they are present, there has to be obviously, protection strategies implemented by the developer or by the property owner. You know, it's complicated. It's typical legal stuff I'm not going to go into, but it is there, and, you know, they do receive protection, which is very good because they certainly need it. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, medium to small scale research projects that are maybe not government run, but are sort of private or small scale or medium scale. So there's a lot of different projects, and, you know, and obviously working with universities as well across not just Ontario, but all of North America, looking at our bats and, you know, how to help protect them. And then finally, you know, how can people help? I mean, there's 10 quick things. So you spread the word. I mean, just tell people how amazing they are. That's really important because people often have a bad opinion about them. Don't destroy habitat. I can't stress that enough. I mean, if you have forest or woodland, don't cut it down, like leave it. If you can, if you have no choice, it's fine. But if you can, don't touch it. Just let nature take its course. I mean, old dead trees, bat hotels, like they're so important for so many species, not just bats. And don't undervalue what an old or dying or dead tree can do. If you can leave it safely, leave it. That's really often the best thing to do. Wildflowers, grasses, we know they're good for bees. We know they're good for a lot of natural pollinators. But I mean, obviously, you get more insects, you get more bats. Even if they don't directly eat that particular species, there's an offshoot effect. You get more diversity, more flying insects. It's good for the bats. Reduce any chemicals and pesticides as much as you can. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's really important. There's a trickle-down effect, again, all the way through the entire food web, and reducing it is really, really helpful. Not to stoke this, but, you know, on behalf of bats and birds, once again, cats should be indoors. I mean, that's my opinion, which is backed up by hundreds and hundreds of research papers. The predation on bats is less than birds, but it's still there. And once again, if your cat unintentionally, to you as the owner, kills a bat that survived white nose syndrome, that's pretty tragic when you think about it from the point of view of the survival of that species, right? Artificial light sources, they're really harmful. So, you know, turn your lights off when you don't need them, or buy lights that are facing downward or lower level. There's a lot of environmentally friendly light sources you can install, which would be very good for bats and wildlife in general. Clean water sources. So if you have the ability to have a pond or something like that in your property, that's great. I would also say that if you happen to live kind of in the country and you have a huge pool and you use chlorine regularly, the bats may be trying to drink that, and they don't know it's chlorine until they drink it. And you know, highly chlorinated water drinking for a tiny animal that's like 5 grams isn't the greatest thing. So I know quite a few people who have pools will sort of intentionally cover them when they're not using them, or leave lights on. I know I'm hypocritical, but leave lights on so bats won't be using them, because you don't really want bats drinking your pool water if it's highly chlorinated. But a natural water source is great. If possible, don't exclude bats that are using your building. If they're in an attic or something and you can find a way to live with them, which can be done, believe it or not, that's great. If you don't have to exclude them, don't. I'm speaking as someone who's been over here in the UK for quite a few months. The amount of people that live with bats in their property is astounding, and they really coexist well. So it can be done if you're willing to do it, and it's really good for the bats. Finally, bat boxes, and I'll go really quick into this. They can be useful. This is the website I usually recommend, which is Bat Conservation International, batcon.org. They have you know, free blueprints you can download. You know, the size and the shape and the style varies. You know, people use different styles. This is one that a friend of mine used before he even knew I was into bats. You know, we became friends after, and he put this bat box up, and you can see that based on the droppings, it's very well used. In fact, I just checked with him, and it's still being used as of last summer. And finally, with bat boxes, there's a lot of information out there. There's a few things you got to remember. They have to get morning sun, so southeast is best, facing southeast, but they can't get direct sunlight all day because they'll cook in the afternoon. So they're kind of picky, which, you know, if you have babies and you're raising them, you'd be a little picky too, right? So they want to get morning sun. They don't want to get sun at 5 o'clock when it's, you know, 30 degrees outside. The general consensus is 20 feet away from trees, but as you could tell by that, that's not 20 feet away from trees, and there's lots of bats in it. So you can be a little more flexible, but there's still a lot of debate on this subject. I could talk specifically about it later, but yeah, in some cases you can put them closer to trees. It just really depends on what you have available to you, is what I would say. I would say this: it's better to be close to trees and out of the sun at 5 p.m. than the alternative. Let's leave it at that. Near areas of bat activity, yeah, sure. If you see bats, that's where you want to put them. So water, forest edge, don't put them in the middle of a farm field where there's no bats. You know, put them near where bats are going to be. They're more likely to find them. And you got to have patience, because it can take quite a while for bats to find them. I often recommend 2 years or more until you consider moving them. And more is better. If you have the money and you got a big property, don't put 1 up, put 2, put 3, put 4. I mean, you know, it's not that expensive. It's a nice project in the summer. Maybe you got, you know, your daughter or son do it with you, and it's fun. And really, what's the harm? So if you have the room and the money, just do more. And finally, this is a really cool project that is just started up. I don't know how long. I think they've only been doing it the last few months. The Wilderness Conservation Society of Canada is actually sort of helping to work a project with a student from Trent University who's actually looking at bat boxes across Canada. And this is really important because so little is known about what actually works and what doesn't. So when I give you advice, or anybody gives you advice, you know what? It's often based on what other people have told them or what they've seen. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, because we don't have enough data to actually say what's right or wrong. So if you have a bat box or you know anyone, definitely, you know, that's the website down there. We can, I'm sure we can Google it, or maybe, you know, maybe I can send it to you later. But, you know, wcsbats.ca, and you'll find it through to that project. It's really cool. Okay, so I think it went a couple minutes long. Sorry about that. But that is the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing screen now, and then I think we can start looking at some questions here.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thank you so much.
Great.
I do have the questions up, so I can read them to you. I think they're pretty clear. So
yeah, I mean, if you want to read them that way, yeah, that way, then other people can hear them too. Do you want to do that?
yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. That's good.
Okay, and you can kind of tell the theme starts at the beginning of your presentation and moves forward. So the first question is from Jane, and she's asking, given how much fruit is grown in Southern Ontario, why haven't fruit bats arrived here? Might they if weather warms more?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess the first thing I would say to that, there's two parts. Like, why aren't they here now, and could they come? In terms of why they aren't here now, I would say the easiest answer is if you think about the fruit we're growing, it's farmed, it's kind of artificial. I mean, it's great. I mean, there's nothing better than an Ontario peach in the summer, but it's not, the quantity of fruit would not be anywhere near that much, say 300 years ago, right? And these bats would have evolved from thousands of years. So there just was never enough fruit here for fruit bats to survive in the temperate zone. So that's why they weren't here originally. And that's the case across, you know, all of Canada, northern United States, and all of the northern part of Eurasia. Could they come here in the future? Well, my answer would be, don't take it the wrong way, because I love fruit bats. I really hope not, because if we do, that means that climate change has really lost control, because nobody's going to be living in most of the United States if that's the case, because it would have to be semi-tropical to tropical for us to get them, because there are fruit bats in the southern United States, but our climate would have to be like Florida or Texas. And that might sound fun in the winter, but it wouldn't be good for the planet. So I hope we don't. And I'd like to think we won't get them in Ontario.
Okay, and the second one from Jane is sort of similar, and it might be a big question, but how will the distribution and population of bats be affected by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. It is a big question. I would say well, both of them are difficult to give definite answers to. What I would say is that there's many studies, a lot of data that has shown that the general population of animals is moving northward, essentially. So the range limits are going farther north, which again sounds good until you realize that eventually species that live in the north run out of range. So that's a problem. So it is really difficult. You know, there's so many models for climate change itself that to then adapt them to individual species is difficult to predict. So I can't give a definite answer. What I will say is that species that are more adaptable, for example, the big brown bat, are more likely to be okay and adapt to it and not see a significant, you know, reduction in their population, and arguably in some areas maybe an improvement. Whereas the more specialized and the more restricted range species, they're always the ones that suffer. So it's likely to have some species that benefit, but definitely going to be some species that are going to suffer and could potentially face localized or greater extinctions. That would be the best answer I can give.
Okay. Janet asks, from one of the maps, the range maps, she noticed that one of the species is in the Hawaiian Islands. Are those subspecies?
Yeah, that's a sharp eye, Janet. That's great. Yeah, it is a subspecies of hoary bat. Yeah, so it's a resident. They don't like migrate back and forth. they do actually live on the island year round. But it is the same species, but she's bang on. It's a subspecies that's native to the island. That's a really good question.
Okay, and Renee asks, how long are the young dependent on the parent?
Yeah, another good question. And again, as is so common, this varies a little bit, but it's around 4 to 6 weeks. And then they become basically independent and no longer nursing. But at that age, like if you catch a bat that's 6 weeks of age, I mean, it's skinny, it's thin, its bones are still hardening. I love them, but they're kind of dumb still. They're kind of figuring out, oh my God, what am I doing? How does this echolocation work? But no, seriously, they learn a lot. And even if they're no longer nursing with their parents, they'll often follow their parents around. and feed on their own, but be in the area of their parents and of other bats. There's a lot of research still to be done on this whole subject, but a lot of bats do what's called swarming. It depends on the species, but swarming is where bats, especially in the end of the summer and the beginning of the winter, before hibernation, they meet at these sort of meeting areas, and a lot of it is for breeding, but a lot of it is also that young bats are learning what to do. How do I court a female? How do I act if I'm a female? Where do I go? What am I? They're just learning a lot. So although they may be independent, quote unquote, at say 5 weeks, they're still learning from being around their parents and other bats for really most of the summer and into the early fall in many species.
Okay, great. That's actually really cool. All right, Sue is asking a sort of personal question. So we moved into a home where the already installed box faces north and gets very little sun, but bats have been there most summers. Should we keep it there?
Yes, 100%. If you're getting them, you leave it. I mean, if they're finding a way to leave it, I mean, it could be, I don't know how many you have. You may only have 3 or 4 or 5. You may have 50 or 100. I don't know for sure. But regardless, if you have bats, don't mess with it. Don't mess with a winning formula. 2 things you can do is you can do what's called an exit count, which is actually something, if you go to that website I mentioned, they'll ask you to do. But basically an exit count is go outside in the summer on a nice night, get a lawn chair, maybe you get a beer, it's up to you, not too many, maybe 1. And basically when it gets to dusk, watch that box very carefully and count, boom, 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 how many come out. Do it till it's too dark to see. You don't have to do too high tech about the timing. When it's too dark and you can't see, you're done. But how many do you get? If you get 30, 40, 50, then that's a nursery. Those are females raising their young. If you get 3 or 4, then they could just be males or young bats or females that didn't have a baby this year. And the reason I mentioned it is that if it's a nursery, that's really cool because they're breeding in an area that's cooler. But if it's if it's sort of a bachelor males, it's still valuable, but it's not quite as valuable as a nursery would be. One more thing you could do, not to spend hours on this question, but it's very relevant, is you could potentially install a second box almost beside the one you have that is facing south or southeast. That often is very common, and that gives bats the chance to move a little bit, even depending on the season. So for example, the spring, they might be in the warmer area. Later in the summer, they might move to the other box. So I wouldn't move it at all, but if you can add one facing a different direction, I mean, that's great. Again, more is always better. Just make sure you do it before they're in it with babies. Don't do it in June, okay? Do it in the fall. Do it in like October, November, just to be safe. Don't do it in the summer because you don't want to disturb them if they're there in the summer at all.
All right, good advice. This is Sue again. So why do bats carry viruses, but the virus doesn't affect them? She's thinking about the current pandemic, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's again, really complicated subject, but the general answer is twofold. Well, I guess it's actually onefold, and then you can branch off. Basically, bats have a really, really, really good immune system. They have arguably the strongest immune system of any mammals as a group. And there's a lot of theories about that, but one of the theories is that bats, being the only mammals that fly, when you're flying, you're burning off, you're tearing down muscle tissue all the time. I mean, it's like a constant running for us, right? So your body has to be able to reproduce those cells quickly. Your body has to be able to regenerate rapidly. And this regeneration doesn't just translate to muscle tissue, it translates to white blood cells and your immune system. So for viruses to be able to impact the bat, it has to be really tough, really virulent type of virus. That's also why rabies can incubate in them longer than, well, it does incubate in them longer than other mammals, which is why they're a potential vector. You could have a bat acting normal that does have rabies, whereas that period of time before they show symptoms is quite small in other mammals. It can be quite long in bats. So that's why they can be virulent. And most of these viruses, it depends. A lot of these viruses will eventually impact old, sick, or weak bats, but healthy ones fight them off. And I mean, honestly, the amount of viruses that humans have in our system all the time that don't make us sick would probably be pretty startling. If we actually did, like a mouse swab looking for every single type of virus in a human throughout his life or his or her life, it'd be pretty startling. But very few of them actually make us sick because our immune system fights them off. The difference in a bat is their immune system is just so strong that the ones that survive are quite virulent in many cases. I mean, that's the simplest answer I can give in a few minutes, basically.
All right. I think this is a good one for everyone to know. Christy, sort of a two-part question. She asked two.
Mhm.
How would you recommend someone interested in working with bats get involved for, volunteering work or work opportunities? And then she also asked what to do if you come across a bat with suspected white nose syndrome. What's the proper protocol for maybe someone who doesn't know what to do?
Yeah, well, let me quickly, I'll answer the white nose one first because it's probably maybe a little simpler, but I'll just get it out of the way sort of. What I would say is that most people are probably not going to encounter a bat with white nose syndrome in the summer because normally they're going to be affected by it during hibernation. I suppose if you found one that was dead, that died sort of naturally in the summer and it had the scarring on the wings that really bad, that would be one that would have it. But it's not going to happen often for people. You're more likely to find them in hibernation. Having said that, if you do happen to find it, if you see a bat and you're like, wow, this looks really weird. Like if you see a bat and it just looks really healthy, but it just died, or maybe a cat killed it. I hope not, but maybe, or maybe it starved, or maybe it got hit by a car, or whatever, but it looks normal. Then, dispose of it safely. Don't touch it with bare hands. And that's just nature. But yes, if you find one that looks notably sick and something's really wrong, the skin is burned looking or injured or damaged in the face and the wings. Yeah, I mean, I don't have the website off the top of me at the exact moment, but if you go on to the MNR or the MEF, I'm sorry, I'm out of date. They're changing the ministry, but the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, what it formerly used to be. I know they've changed it since I've been out of Canada. They changed it the year I left, so I can't remember the actual acronym off the top of my head now, but yes, if you go onto their website, which it will be a lot simpler to find on Google than it is for me to remember the acronym, then there are methods to report animals on there. So basically, you go to the government and explain it to them, and if it's something that they suspect sounds like it could be white nose and it would be relevant to their research, then they will contact you for more information. That's what I would suggest. In terms of getting involved in it, yeah, it's not the easiest thing in many ways, especially, well, today with COVID, most research is suspended, at least hands-on research. Passive research is continuing, but hands-on is suspended or greatly limited. What I would say is, I mean, it depends on where you are in your career, obviously, but if you're younger and you're just getting started, or your child's interested, there's a lot of, in a non-COVID year, there's a lot of local organizations that do bat walks. I know, like in Toronto, for example, High Park does that. So really look at your, obviously this land trust does a lot of bat blitzes and bat walks and events, sometimes periodically as well. Just keep an eye on your local nature groups and local, government agencies that do outreach. That's a great place to get started. In terms of structured, surveys, there are a few that exist, but they're not the easiest to get into. So it's not as simple. I'd love to tell you it's really simple, but it's not that simple. I think the best thing is just look for every possible opportunity you can. Obviously, if you get into university and you're studying it, there's a lot of universities are doing projects on it. They have, like, a lot of professors are really specialized in that. And, I mean, I'm not trying to surf for applicants, but the organization I work for, we do bat research, and we take interns and volunteers down in Peru, which gives people hands-on experience, different species, of course, but hands-on experience with bats and how to survey them, which is very useful knowledge to gain, and that can be useful trying to get into jobs and work opportunities. So it's not the easiest thing, but it's getting easier in some ways because there's more research. So really keep your eyes open for opportunities to get out there. And I tell anyone, if you are around someone doing a bat walk or doing bat research, or anyone, be friendly, be outgoing, add them as a friend on Facebook or Instagram. Just try to just get yourself in there as much as you can. That's I know that sounds like really generic advice, but that's always kind of the best advice, I would say.
I totally agree with you. I'd say our people in our field are so social.
Yeah.
Networking is really key, but it can be very casual, and you make fantastic friends through it as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, Chris, are you okay if I pick two more questions that sort of have to do with what to do in your...
Yeah, I'm fine. If people are willing to listen to me talk for a few more minutes, I'm happy to stay.
It looks like we still have a lot of people interested. So I'll just pick two more about your property. So, does BT used as a pesticide affect bats?
I'm going to plead ignorance on exactly what BT is. I probably should know, but I'm not sure what exact chemical or pesticide that is, actually. So I can't comment on it because I'm not sure what it is. I would say that if it's something that is specifically, targeting insects or yeah, if it's targeting insects and as a pesticide, it probably could directly or indirectly, but I don't want to make a broad statement without knowing exactly what BT is. So I apologize for not knowing that. If you know what it is, Nikki, feel free to let me know. But
I was gonna say I don't know what it is either. So
yeah,
but Janet, if you wanted to send an email after, we could always figure out how to answer it.
yeah.
And Janet has one more. So which kind of light bulbs are good to use so that insects are not drawn in? If you know this answer, she's suggesting the yellow LED lights.
Yeah, so actually it's not that you don't want to draw the insects in, it's the opposite. It's that you don't want the bats to be scared away by the lights. That's what it is. So there's a pretty wide range of different lights that a lot of the LED lights are good, but you do have to make sure which spectrum it's on. You know, there's some guides online you can look at to see which lights specifically are best. And it's not just the light, it's also the direction of the light. A lot of lights, so it's the color spectrum, but it's also the direction. A lot of light, like if you think of a light that's just a broad light that just goes everywhere, then that creates this bubble of light, which, you know, bats are just like, it's too bright. I feel scared being in that light. Whereas if it's very directional, I mean, arguably sometimes in old, not that we really use them much anymore anyways, the old incandescent lights, but, you know, those would be arguably maybe some of the worst lights for bats. But if they're really directional and they're just focusing on like a piece of brick or like a stone walkway below them and above them is totally dark, I mean, that's probably less damaging than a low impact light that's spread everywhere. Okay, because bats don't want to be illuminated when they're flying. And as they say that, there's going to be people who are probably listening saying, yeah, but wait a minute, I've seen bats fly through streetlights. I've seen bats fly across my backyard. And you're right, you have. And actually bats in some cases can really like lights that bring insects in because it's like a buffet, it's bringing them to them. But put yourself in the bat's mind. And I think this is important because then you can kind of in your own mind design a plan in your backyard that would be good. The bats don't want to be seen while they're flying through the air unless it's a split second. And the reason is instinctually bats realize that one of the only things that really catch them in the day are falcons and hawks like Cooper's hawks, sharp-shinned hawks. A merlin, kestrels not really, they prefer rodents, but yeah, three big ones right off the bat: merlins, sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks. Those are really good examples. And if they're illuminated instinctually, bats are like, oh God, these falcons and hawks are much faster than me. They're going to pluck me out of the sky. But as soon as it's dark, those birds can't see at all. They see only in the light. There's no nocturnal vision. So that's like, I can't touch any. I'm in the dark. So if it's illuminated in the whole area, the bat's like, I can't go there. I'm going to die. But if it's one little draw, like straight line of light, and there's insects there, and the bat can just go boom, 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 back and forth through the light, the bat feels relatively safe doing that. So try to imagine the situation from a bat's perspective. Would you feel safe knowing something bigger than you wants to pluck you out of the sky? Would you feel safe flying around or not? If the answer is yes, there's a decent chance the bats will be okay with it. If the answer is no, they're probably not going to be. And in terms of the direction of light, that's really important. And yes, there are certain lights that are much better for nocturnal animals than others. Often red lights and different colors are better. It depends on what aesthetic you're trying to build. If you're really interested, which is great, definitely go online. There's some guides that'll tell you the light spectrums, how they impact animals. And using that guide in conjunction with the direction of your light can have a really positive impact on how it impacts, nocturnal wildlife, not just bats.
All right. So I just want to apologize to everyone for going a little late, but I think those questions just really added to Chris's presentation. So hopefully you all think it's worth it. I know we still have a lot of people on, so I think they were. And Chris, thank you so much for your presentation. We do bat walks every once in a while. They can be a little tricky because we like to do them late at night and not everyone is eager to get out, but I hope after hearing you talk about it, they are. And I just also wanted to throw out there a little plug from us that the Land Trust does sometimes have programs where we can do habitat building. So for example, we may be able to pay for bat box supplies. So if you have maybe a group of neighbors that want to get together and build some bat boxes, either for our properties or maybe your own backyard, we might be able to do something like that. So you're always welcome to email us and see what opportunities we can maybe build on together. And I think that's a really fantastic idea. We've done bird boxes and things like that, and we have so many properties where bats would just absolutely love it. We also do bioblitzes, like Chris said, or walks, where I think our guides would really appreciate a like an assistant or something to keep track of time and things like that. And so if you want a little bit of networking, a little bit of conversation with our guides, that's always a good opportunity too. So with that, we're hitting 2:30. So thank you so much to everyone who's staying on. And again, thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure, and some really great questions. And yeah, I'll just say, I mean, obviously there's really qualified people at Oak Ridge and Moraine Land Trust can answer questions. And if anybody is interested in getting a hold of me at all, you know, my name's pretty easy to find, Chris Ketola. Not that many Ketolas out there on Facebook or Instagram. And always happy to chat with anybody, or if you want to see what I'm doing down in Peru, you can always check it out. So yeah, thanks to everyone for asking me to do this. I had a great time talking about the bats in Ontario. They will always be near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to working with them again in the future, hopefully.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Bye now.
Bye.